Dear speakers, dear attendees, welcome to today's webinar on cultural humility, where our speakers will present the second edition of the book, Cultural Humility, Engaging Diverse Identities in Therapy. A link to purchasing this fascinating and important book will be posted in the chat shortly. Today's event is a joint event by SPR and APA, which is a very exciting collaboration between the associations. Please note that the event is being recorded and will later be uploaded to the SPR YouTube channel. The link to the channel will also be in the chat in a couple of minutes. Before we begin, we would like to bring your attention to two important updates. The early bird registration to the annual SPR conference in Japan will open next week. We would be very happy to see you all there in person. However, please do remember that you have the option to present virtually. So if you cannot be there in person, please consider this. Also, we have a webinar series upcoming on the expansion of skills in psychotherapy and the integration of new advances, organized by Professor Christophe Fouquiger and Professor Stigar Camano. The first event is scheduled for April 1st, and the link to the SPR event calendar will also be in the chat, and then you can stay up to date on upcoming events. Finally, before we begin, I will just mention that questions will be taken at the end. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat and they will be addressed later. And during the discussion, feel free to just unmute and ask whatever question you have. Thank you all for your attention up until now. Now I am honored to present our four speakers for today. So we have Joshua Hook, who received his doctorate in counseling psychology from Virginia Commonwealth University. He is a professor of psychology at the University of North Texas and also a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Texas. His professional interests include humility, religion and spirituality, and multicultural counseling. He has published more than 300 journal articles and scholarly book chapters, as well as several books. In his free time, he enjoys running, practicing karate, and cheering on the Chicago Bears. He lives in Dallas, Texas, with his wife and two children. We have Don Davis, who is a professor of psychology at Georgia State University. He received his doctorate at Virginia Commonwealth University as well, and is licensed in the state of Georgia. He is a member of the Ken Matheny Center for the Study of Stress, Trauma, Resilience, and co-founded the Good Life Research Network. His work focuses on humility and virtues like forgiveness and gratitude, and the role of religion and spirituality in character development. He has published more than 300 articles or chapters in addition to books and is an associate editor of the Journal of Positive Psychology. He is married to Cirleen DeBlaere and has three children. Cirleen is one of the authors of the book that we will be discussing today. However, unfortunately, she couldn't join us. Jesse Owen is a professor and distinguished scholar in the counseling psychology department at the University of Denver. He is a licensed psychologist and holds various positions, including lead psychologist of Lifelong Inc., research director of Celeste Health, senior research advisor for Sonder Mind, senior research advisor for Org Vitals, and editor for psychotherapy. He has co-authored 3 books and has over 250 publications. His research focuses on process and outcomes of psychotherapy with a focus on therapist expertise, multicultural orientation, and couple interventions, and he is a co-founder of the Multicultural Orientation Framework. His research has been supported by foundations, federal agencies, and private companies. Elise Choe is an assistant professor at the Counseling Psychology Department in the Department of Counseling and Psychological Services. Her research interests include how virtues and strengths may promote resilience for individuals and groups. She is also interested in the deconstruction and reconstruction of psychological theories, models, and constructs from a critical multicultural lens to more fully capture the experiences of diverse individuals and communities. Her research interests also include examining psychotherapy processes and how to help clinicians personally flourish to improve their professional work. So thank you all for being here. Please start whenever you feel ready.
Josh, you kicking us off? Or did we lose Josh?
I think we might have lost him.
Oh
Okay, well,
no.
welcome everybody. I guess I'll kick us off till Josh jumps back in, and then I'll hand it off to Donna here. Um, Thank you all for being here. We're really pleased to have updated and published our second edition of the Culture Humility book about engaging diverse identities in psychotherapy and supervision. This book is a great advancement from our first edition, where we had limited information, limited research on the topic, and now we really integrated a lot more of our research findings into this book. And so it really covers the gamut of our three main pillars of multicultural orientation, which is our main pillar of cultural humility, that intra and interpersonal stance of curiosity, unknowing, and kind of engagement into suspending some assumptions and judgments. And that this is one of the pillars that I think has been pivotal for us in our training and as we've been educating folks for a while now, where just as clinicians and humans, like we're just very quick to jump to assumptions. And in the research on clinical judgment, as most of you know, is that we make initial impressions of our clients within 30 seconds of knowing them. And that whole process of just suspending that and understanding kind of what else could there be, and having that curiosity, especially through a cultural lens, is um, is a really important pillar for us. And in this book, we discuss not only what it means to do that in a way, but we do it in a way that where we now start to highlight more around the theoretical orientation. So what does this cultural humility look like through like a CPT lens, a humanistic, a psychodynamic lens? So we do have some good examples there that kind of help people kind of fit it in within whatever theoretical orientations that they're facing. We also really embrace some of the feedback and discussion we got about what does this look like in different formats for people with different identities. So, what does cultural humility look like if you're coming from a minoritized identity and kind of running into that space of saying, well, maybe being humble is to really listen to some pretty awful things. And so, how do we manage that as therapists? How do we manage that with our supervisees? And our book kind of goes into some of those really difficult and challenging conversations. And throughout the book, we try to balance that sense that not everybody's reading this book from the same vantage point. I think that's really important from especially from an SPR crowd, in particular, knowing the international connections and how important it can be to really think about different identities, even if your nation is homogenous in certain ways. And so we try to really kind of frame that through an intersectionality lens. I'm going to pause here. Josh, I see you're back on. I was just kind of giving a little bit of an overview of some of the updates as you were reconnecting.
Yeah, I apologize. Bad timing for my internet to go out. That's all part of it. So, um, have we done introductions and kind of on to my initial part? Is that where we're at in the program?
Yeah, I've just
Okay.
been doing a couple of brief
Um,
updates. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, good to see everyone. Happy to get started. And in introduction, my name is Joshua Hook. I'm a professor at UNT and also program director and DCT. And a little bit about just our kind of how we're organizing the talk. We're going to talk briefly about kind of how a little bit of background and history about how we got interested in cultural humility and multicultural orientation. And we're each going to talk a little bit about how we're using cultural humility in our own context, um, in our own work setting. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book, and then my colleagues are going to share a little bit about some of the things that they're passionate about with cultural humility work. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion at that point. So just briefly, this is several years ago now, but I was doing research on humility with some of my colleagues, and we were basically looking at humility in some different contexts where it was difficult to practice. So things like marital and couple relationships, religious differences, leadership, and cultural differences was one of those areas where we thought humility might be particularly relevant as well. At the same time, I was teaching multicultural counseling for graduate students at my university. And um, there was a lot of pressure that I was noticing in my students to kind of get it right and really kind of in some cases come across as competent, and a lot of fear around saying the wrong thing and things like that. And what I was noticing, and I guess both in my research and in my work in the classroom, was that students really wanted to be culturally responsive, felt a lot of pressure to get it right, which sometimes made it hard to be open, honest, and curious about their own process and growth. And so I felt like humility really seemed to be a helpful framework for engaging in work and training around addressing culture and identities in therapy. So Jesse, do you want to say just a couple words about how you got started in MCO and how that developed?
Yeah, so most of my work, as many of you all know, has been really focused on how can we make therapy better and kind of looking at those access points. And what I noticed, and the reason why we developed the MCO framework, which includes cultural humility, cultural opportunities, and cultural comfort, um, it was to really kind of put a process model in place for understanding how does therapy work and what are the specific things that we're looking for. And so the predominant models at the time have been looking at things like knowledge, and yet there's not many studies looking at knowledge from a multicultural standpoint in therapy outcomes. And so I was really trying to figure out what is it that we're really trying to do in that space, and in that space is the human element of just being with another person and understanding and connecting to their values and understanding where they're coming from and vice versa. That this kind of co-construction of what Paul Wachtell talks about is the two-person model of therapy really influenced a lot of how I wrote about multicultural orientation and a lot of other influences like Carl Rogers and a lot of psychodynamic and systems theories influence that. But I think this is where we're at in terms of a process model. And I think where we're going with this through technology and some of the things that we've been developing for training purposes is really exciting, and including using artificial intelligence to do feedback and try to bring this to scale so that people can really understand and connect. So I'll kick it over to Donnie.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah. Oh,
I'll
Donnie,
kick it
I'm
back
gonna.
to I can
Okay,
kick it back to you, Josh.
sorry, a little bit of mix up in the order, but I'm going to talk about the book now for a few minutes.
Joshua, I'm sorry, you're on mute.
All right,
There
am
you
I
go.
back? Okay.
Yes, you are.
That's-
Joshua?
okay. Yep, I'm back.
Yeah, there
Uh,
it is.
there it is. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about the book and what's new in the second edition. And so if we split up the book into two main sections. So the first section talks about sort of the theoretical foundation for the work we're doing. So we kind of go into a deep dive about what cultural humility is, and then also the other two components of the MCO model, so which stands for multicultural orientation, so cultural comfort and cultural opportunities. And then we also talk some about exploring your own limits and biases and putting together a plan for working on those biases and limits. Um, in that section too, we talk about kind of different ways and strategies to engage in social justice work from a culturally humble stance. And so in that first part, we're kind of talking about cultural humility not only as an identity, but also hopefully as a personal practice that you can implement over time. And then the second part of the book is really, in my opinion, kind of where most of the book lives. And it's kind of how to integrate cultural humility and MCO into some of the main processes of therapy. So things like building a strong working alliance with clients, navigating value differences, working with cultural ruptures when they happen in therapy. Um, what do you do when you come across a limit in your work with clients? And it's yeah, in my sense, hopefully, it's kind of there's sort of a clear integration between some of the multicultural components that we think are important and what's actually happening in the therapy room. Um, in terms of what's new in the second edition, it's interesting how times have changed. So we wrote this book, it was published in 2017. So we were writing it, a couple years before then. And a lot's changed in the world since then. But I do think something that's consistent, or maybe even more important nowadays, or more relevant nowadays, is that it's difficult to maintain connections at times with people who are different from us, and to connect across cultural differences and across aisles. And I think that continues to be an important problem in our society. And I think it continues to, I think, be an important reason why cultural humility is I think more relevant and important than ever. Um, in the new edition, some things are kind of typical. Like, we updated the research. A lot of studies have proliferated around cultural humility, cultural comfort, and cultural opportunities in therapy, and so we've updated all that. We've updated case examples, exercises based on some of our experiences in terms of what's been helpful in our training contexts. One of the things, and Jesse's going to talk a little bit more about this, but one of the things we really tried to do was add more contextual and developmental nuance to how we're thinking about cultural humility in MCU. So how cultural humility might be experienced differently, or based on the level of power and privilege of the therapist. Um, Also, we added material on how cultural humility MCO can help address systemic or structural issues that our clients face. Um, Another thing that I think can be helpful in the second edition is there's a bunch of ancillary materials for instructors that are available for this edition. And I think, you know, again, I'll move on fairly quickly, but one thing I think that differentiates this text from other more traditional multicultural counseling texts is that it's not really organized by group necessarily, like one chapter on counseling this particular group or that particular group, but it's organized around core therapeutic processes that we think are important, and how culture and identities sort of intersect with those. I think it can be used in a couple different ways. I think it could be used as a core text in a multicultural counseling course. If you're looking for a text, I think it also could be used as an adjunctive text in sort of like a counseling skills course, or a practicum, or a supervision course. So anything like that, I think, could be helpful. And I think, just to maybe wrap up things we're thinking about in the book and how we view cultural humility, at its core, I think we see cultural humility is as less about like saying the right thing in certain situations, or even really knowing exactly what to do in therapy, but about sustaining a way of relating to clients around culture and identities, especially when things come up that are hard or uncertain or difficult to navigate. So yeah, encourage you to check out the book if you're interested. And I think, see, you are next, so I'll kick it over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so just a little bit more I threw into the chat the website for multicultural orientation. On that website, you'll see a lot of different measures that we've been developing over time for psychotherapy, as well as there's group psychotherapy measures, um, as well as external rated measures. We also have on that website a bunch of our publications, and in those and on that tab, you can actually click on a podcast, so you can actually um, listen to the article versus having to read it, and a lot of resources for instructors there as well on these measures. So a lot of fun stuff right there for you all in terms of resources, and we really want to make that more available. We keep trying to update it as we have more measures and things to come. The other thing that one of the things that we really wanted to emphasize within this new edition was really trying to connect the the personhood of the therapist, because what we were seeing in the research is that the therapist really matters a lot, and it kind of ties into some of this therapist expertise of really knowing who the clinician is and what they bring to the table. And what we've been noticing in our research, that it's not all that predictable about who's going to have more disparities in their caseload or not. Yet we wanted to center some of our writing on this, that it's not just for privileged white, at least in America, white therapists, but it's really understanding the intersectionality of who the therapist is, all the ideas they bring to the table. And in like one of our recent case studies, we found that even when we tried to predict which training videos would be the most easiest for certain clinicians, it didn't even match to identities. So there's a lot of these things that around, some people call it transference, countertransference reactions that we have that are really important to know and know that it's not necessarily as cookie cutter as one would think in terms of making it just a one-to-one identity match. And so really practicing and getting some of these pieces out there are really important. Um, the other thing that I would say, as we've been going around talking about the book, but also doing trainings with folks, the other thing is just to really challenge people to have metrics of um, of outcomes. So the expertise literature, as we know some therapists are better than others, we know some supervisors are better than others, but the real question is how will we know what we don't know? And especially when it comes from a cultural standpoint, this is one of the things that we're encouraging folks to really take a look at is like, how would you know your supervisees are doing okay? How would you know that you're doing okay as a therapist? And what are those metrics that you're looking at? And at the minimum, we encourage folks to at least look at dropout rates, because that's probably the simplest thing that we can probably measure. Um, and so within that, it's like, how are we understanding ourselves from a cultural standpoint? Like, how are we looking at different and intersecting identities of clients, and are we doing better or worse with others? And so some of that stuff is the magic in which this book kind of talks to about how do you truly understand yourself as a therapist? How do you get comfortable with yourself in these spaces? How do you understand when you're running away from things? And that's what we really challenge folks to understand. All right, I'm going to kick it over to Elise or Josh, back to you.
Yeah, Elise, you're up next.
Sounds great. Hello, everyone. I'm Elise Choe. And I'm going to, continue building off of this topic that Jesse and Josh has brought up about the complexity, I think, that cultural humility is. I think or I say we, like we all know, but maybe you don't. But like cultural humility has been found to be really great, right? In a lot of different ways. Great for, better therapeutic outcomes, therapeutic alliances. It helpful in rupture and repair processes. There's some, initial work that we found that, or a therapist's cultural humility can help improve or influence and increase the cultural humility of a client. And that also have mental health outcomes and treatment outcome implications. So cultural humility has a lot of wonderful things and potential. And also, I think depending on the identities or the socio-cultural, geopolitical kind of environment you might be in, it also needs to be kind of yielded or wielded with caution. Um, culture humility, one of the biggest pieces, the major component of it is the other-oriented stance, where you're trying to be respectful and hold the cultural values of someone else that might be different from yours. And that's easier said than done, especially when there's more complex dynamics that get played out in a therapeutic room. For example, when the clinician themselves hold more marginalized identities than their client. So I'm going to speak from a US perspective as a clinician in the US, and that being my only experience. But, when I'm a female clinician of color and I work with a white or even a white male client, there's a lot of power dynamics happening there, right? I, as a therapist, hold some power, but the client in society hold a lot more power than I. So what do I do? My training and my approach to my psychotherapeutic work is that I be culturally humble. But what if my client microaggresses against me? Probably, right? Not intentionally, not with any malicious intent, but out of, our ingrained stereotypes or biases, and it happens. Well, my training so far is that's my counter transference. I take it out, and if I'm still in supervision, go to my supervisor. If I'm lucky enough to have peer consultation available, I go to my colleagues and do peer consultation and I take it out of the room, right? But what if you're in private practice? It's not easily accessible. And again, even for our trainees, when I think we're not taught or we don't really have a system, a way of teaching them of how to even recognize if something like that happens and then what to do with that, right? Oh, I felt hurt by my client. Well, I'm not supposed to. Like, I'm not the thing important here. So what do I do? Well, I should be humble. I should understand this is their culture. This is their perspective. These are their values. I should, as a therapist, hold this. I think then it becomes a little bit more problematic. I always like to think of, again, cultural humility is wonderful. I always joke that if I had like one hammer to all the nails in the world, my hammer is cultural humility. Like if we can just kind of inject it into everyone, I feel like many things would be better. Again, I'm biased. That's my perspective, but I also do believe that there can be too much of a good thing. So a good example is salt. Salt is necessary for our physical, biological processes. It helps our nerves function properly. And as I'm always reminded yearly by my doctor as I get older, too much salt is not good for my health, high blood pressure, heart conditions, etc. So cultural humility, I think, is similar. It needs to be well balanced. It needs to be used with awareness and intention and wisdom. A lot of my colleagues and I have talked about the dialectical tensions that cultural humility needs. We say cultural humility needs to be first balanced within itself, right? You can't be too humble. You also can't be too arrogant. So, like that golden mean kind of perspective from virtue ethics. But it also needs to be balanced with other virtues. So, not just cultural humility all the time by itself, but it needs to be balanced with things like justice and anger, or courage, fortitude, right? And then also, on top of all of that, it needs to be wielded with wisdom or phronesis. This comes from Aristotelian virtue ethics. And phronesis talks about it's basically a meta virtue, like this ultimate hierarchical virtue that helps a person use wisdom and critical awareness of themselves and their context to make the appropriate decision in a moment. So, if I can have phronesis, if I can have wisdom and awareness and insight, I can decide, hopefully, right, ideally, in a moment, my client has microaggressed against me. Is this a moment that I lean into cultural humility? Or is this better that I lean into courage and maybe confront my client, bring it into the room? Because whether the client is aware of it or not, I believe there is a rupture. And the rupture does need to be repaired, especially if we think about, I want to I want to feel positively towards my client. That helps the therapeutic alliance and their outcomes. But if I've been hurt, that's probably not as easy. So I think again, it comes down to figuring out how can I authentically engage in cultural humility while I balance it within itself so it's not too extreme one way or the other, where I don't use it to try and bypass something. So, like, I don't want to deal with conflict. I don't want to be a bad therapist. I don't want to do the wrong thing in the room. And so I'm going to ignore something and bypass it because saying I'm being culturally humble. But rather, I want to be able to use it authentically with awareness, with wisdom. I think that's a really complicated process that, again, the book starts to touch on, and I think there's a lot more conversations happening nowadays. But, it's almost, we're getting there. I don't think there's one easy way to do it. But, I call it Culture Humility 2.0, the next version, the next iteration. And yeah, it's probably going to look a little bit different, a bit more expansive, a bit more nuanced. Over to you, Donnie.
Yeah, thanks, Elise. And yeah, a few of the things that I wanted to say are definitely going to pick up on some of the ideas that Elise just talked about. So what I wanted to start with is one thing I think is unique about the multicultural orientation framework and some of the scholars that are interested in this is I think there really is a growing network of people who are wanting to support early career scholars, both people who are going into academia and wanting to address research practice gaps and really think about how training works. I need to get Jesse to show me the paper where he pulled some of this data, but I remember one of the things that he'll talk about in some of his talks is that the percentage of training sessions that get observed by another human is just embarrassingly low. Like, Jesse, what's the number you tend to cite?
It's less than 1% in most training programs.
Yeah, and that represents my experience. So what we're training people to do, like I was a high school soccer player and American football player, and then I played football in college. There is some time that you spend, drawing things up on the whiteboard and kind of talking about what you're going to do, but most of what ends up affecting your skill level as a player is actually playing and getting feedback on what you do. And so tremendous amounts of time get spent when you're training in a sport, going over your reactions in the moment. And so when I think about my experience in training, there's just so much left on the table for us to get better and better at helping our clients. So when I look, when I got into the field and started to see, some of the data that was science based on how are we doing in terms of serving clients from marginalized groups, and I saw that the data wasn't as encouraging as I would have liked to see, especially after several decades of kind of the multicultural movement. The thing that was actually encouraging is there's a lot that we know about training that we're actually not implementing yet. And so I think as I've gotten kind of closer to the middle of my career, I really want to not just do research that will kind of lead to the next paper, but I want to basically experiment with training practices that I trust might have a shot of actually helping people get better in the ways that we know are possible. And it feels like that I'm part of a community of people that are having the right conversations about what that would look like. I can give you one example of something that I have a frustration about. So there's a current movement towards deliberate practice, for example. And the way to study deliberate practice that's easiest to do for a researcher is to have a 30-second clip, maybe somewhere between 30 seconds and 90 seconds. And then you have people practice kind of a micro skill. Well, I actually think that's a step in the right direction. I think that's really, really good. But when I think about more complex clinical situations, I don't fully trust that if I were to log 15,000 hours doing micro skills, that it's necessarily going to touch on the kind of wisdom that Elise just talked about. So where you have the judgment about yourself as an individual, you have a sense of what your relational patterns are, and you can walk through a season that may take a client, especially if you're working from a framework where you're not going to only do like 6 to 10 sessions, but you possibly may be having longer term therapy with somebody. I don't really have confidence that 30 seconds to 90 seconds, if I were to log a lot more time and even get a lot of feedback on those kind of practice skills, that it will translate into the more complex skills that would help people really develop a type of clinical wisdom that's going to lead to, in studies where we have data on master therapists who are just having really excellent outcomes. My sense is that those people were able to leverage a very different kind of deliberate practice. And if you want to know, I mean, this is where, we get together and we talk about these things and we try to kind of figure out where there might be conceptual leverage that would make a difference. But I think a big part of what people do as they're trying to develop more mature skills is I think you need to be in relationship with, something like 4 to 8 other people where you can talk openly about what you're struggling with clinically. So something more along the lines of peer consultation groups. And so I'm personally very excited about models that are not just thinking about how to have people in individual supervision, group supervision, and kind of get through the hoops of getting, licensed. But what are some what are some ways of engaging training throughout your career that would keep you in kind of high trust relationships where you're able to talk about ambiguous situations that are coming up clinically, get multiple perspectives on what you're doing, and possibly get the kind of feedback that would check some of your assumptions about what you're doing clinically. That's what, if you look at any field that is continuing to kind of improve performance, they're using very similar principles. And so I personally am very attracted to the deliberate practice ideas, but I think my encouragement to the for people doing work on MCO is let's keep going with it, because basically in fields where people are improving performance, they're not just doing it in a way that's easy to study. They're really doing it in a way to make sure that outcomes get better. So I think we're on to something that's very promising. The other thing that I wanted to share, and I'll kind of stop with that, is I've really enjoyed the conversations about more dialectical ways of thinking. And so, and I got to thinking about it. I don't think humility is the only virtue that we're talking about when we talk about MCO. This reference may be a little bit, I'm not sure how well this reference will work on the group, but do y'all remember those books called Where's Waldo? Does anybody remember that? So you're basically searching for this little man that's wearing like I think he's got like a red scarf, and he's buried in a crowd of people. And I got to thinking, are there any other virtues that are just implicit in the MCO framework language? And I think there are. I actually think Karen, when Karen Tao talks about cultural fortitude, and she'll often bring in courage language, I think it takes a level of courage to, when you start to see in a situation a direction that you think is important to go in, it still might be scary, or you may have other feelings that you kind of have to work through. And so basically humility always has to be balanced with the right amount of courage. And I mean, anybody who's heard people talk about courage isn't taking unnecessary risk. It doesn't mean doing things to put yourself in harm's way. It's actually a wise type of risk taking. And so I think that's, I really like it that we're being more explicit about the courage language within MCO. And then the other one that occurred to me is the concept of opportunities. There's actually a hidden virtue within that too. So what is it? When you see the potential for future good, it's actually hope that you're seeing. So there's a type of hope that's being balanced with humility. So I'll kind of stop there, but I do want to just invite, for people who are interested in some of these themes, I think one of the things that's unique about our group is there's just a growing number of people. We really want to support early career professionals. We want to support people in research and practice. And so it's just a really welcoming and generative community. If y'all saw my co-presenter, that's Emerson. We're home from school this week. So thank you. I'll pass it back to Josh.
Thanks, Donnie. Well, I think at this point we've got about 20 minutes left. I think we might open it up for questions and see or discussion. So if you have anything that you're curious about, feel free to either type it in the chat or kind of, you can unmute and share it out loud. I see a hand. Denise, do you want to go?
Yes, thank you. I would like to make a couple of comments. One of them is that cultural humility means a very careful examination of our implicit ways, because, for example, you all speak about client as a person we help. I live in Latin America, and we would never, ever use it. And in my country, Uruguay, there are no indigenous people, not many, but in other countries, in all Aboriginal cultures, the word I does not exist, while in English it is a capital letter. So I think that these implicit ways we have within SPR should be revised. I have said this many times. The other thing is that as we ask therapists and prospective therapists to have their own therapy, to examine their own unresolved issues and their failings, if one is going to work within a different cultural milieu, which does not mean a necessary race or country. For example, prisons, or for example, street dwelling people in a very wide sense of culture. I think that one should have, preferably in groups and preferably with experts, also the chance to analyze what are your values, what are your attitudes, what are you as a person. I don't think you can work with migrants if you agree with ICE. And this is a very important issue, since a therapist is his own tool, that in this sense, then also cultural values are part of what we are, and we should have them very, very clear and know our limits.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, thanks for sharing your perspective, and then also the important point about therapists continuing to be in their own work and doing their own therapeutic work themselves.
I didn't say that.
Sorry, what Denise, did you want to, did I miss something?
But no, that I meant that it is plus of therapeutic work on yourself. It's an analysis of your cultural implications before you work. For example, if you're going to work with adolescent mothers and you think it's the worst that could happen to them, better do not go.
Mm-hmm.
It's complementary to your personal issues. It's your understatements, cultural understatements, which you might even not see.
Thank you.
I see that there's a question in the chat. Danilo, would you like to ask it, or should we read it out? Okay, we can go ahead and read. Okay, perfect. So the question says, cultural humility reminds me of the concept of not knowing from Herlene Anderson and Harry Galushan. Sorry if I mispronounced the name. Does this concept inform cultural humility in a certain way?
Anyone want to take that, or would you like me to take a stab at it?
Yeah, I can say a few thoughts and y'all can chime in. I don't know that I've read that work, but some of our initial work on cultural humility, what we were measuring is probably a little more of an interpersonal component, and oftentimes from the client's perspective. So, is there a sense of cultural humility towards my most salient identities? If I'm in the role of a client, and Denise, I'm actually sorry for using the client language. The Yeah, I'm stuck in my ways. But the I think the part that we're starting to talk more about is, even before you try to behave in a humble way, there's the potential to slow down your automatic reactions to what's happening and kind of your assumptions. And I think that actually does relate to some of Denise's points about implicit processes. So, and I imagine a lot of people are familiar with some of the like dual theories of cognition, and so thinking fast versus thinking slow. I actually do think it is an important part of humility that we have ways of deciding when it's important to slow down and check our assumptions, and even have ways of doing that. So have ways of having other people who would give us feedback. I mean, even on this call, like, Denise's comments of suggesting other ways of kind of using language, that's a type of checking our assumptions, and it's a way that we help each other. And so I think from my perspective, there very much is a part of our training process where we want to put ourselves in a place of trusting other people to give us feedback, to see things that we may not be able to see in ourselves. And that is a type of not knowing. It's kind of a realizing that our reaction to a situation is only a part of what there is to potentially react to. and that there are things that we really don't know or we're not able to see, and that our perspective is limited. So some people, if you wanted to kind of read more literature on this kind of more intrapersonal process, there are people who have talked about intellectual humility, which kind of sounds esoteric. And my take on what's happening with all the naming different types of humility is you haven't said enough to say humility. It's humility about what? Are you humble about your way of relating to another person and kind of trying to decide how to balance what's good for the relationship? Well, that's probably a little more of like a relational humility or a cultural humility. I think when you're humble towards your ideas, so your ideas, when you have a conceptualization of a client, you're really saying what you think is going to happen and what's going to be helpful to the client. And we can have a humility about our conceptualization. That's probably a little closer to intellectual humility, a humility about our ideas. And so, I think that's something we're still talking about is when we say cultural humility, are we referring to the more interpersonal process of how we're relating to somebody? Or are we talking about checking our assumptions and the more interpersonal process and kind of thinking about the ways that we may be wrong, and kind of trying to slow down some of those assumptions? That's my reaction to that comment. I think it's very much related, but I think we're still kind of working on the conceptual language that we want to use with training. Academics proliferate jargon. And I mean, I think we really are about trying to make this practical for training. So, Josh, Jesse, Elise, feel free to correct anything that I said.
I thought you did a good job there.
Yeah, I did too. The one thing I would say is I think the notion of not knowing is a challenging one, right? Because we do know some things. And we do have some base knowledge about certain things, and we don't know certain things about other things. And so the point of cultural humility and what we say in the book is about how do you start getting the knowledge that you need and exposure that you need to different cultures where you're not putting a supervisee, a client into the teaching role for you, right? Because that kind of flips the script a little bit in terms of the power dynamic and the roles. And so we really try to encourage people to find their own motivation of trying to get to know things. And then also taking the stance of knowing that whatever you do know may or may not fully apply to that person, right? And so not to overgeneralize and not to overly assume that just because you have gotten some knowledge or spent some time in a certain country or know the certain group from growing up, that experience is that experience and it can be different from others.
Jesse, there's a question in the chat. No pressure to take this on, but I was curious if you might have something, a reaction there. It says, as you mentioned earlier, deliberate practice is often used in therapists trying to develop micro skills. Do you think incorporating role plays with diverse clients could offer a more dynamic exposure to the therapeutic process while also fostering cultural responsiveness? Yeah, curious if you have thoughts about the role plays in training or how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think role plays are a lot more dynamic than these kind of videos that we've been developing. Because we originally developed those videos kind of paralleling Tim Anderson's work as an assessment tool, and then we've started to turn it into a training tool. The one thing I do like about role plays is that you do get a more naturalistic back and forth. You can read emotions differently. You can do things over time. The challenge that I've seen in some training programs is when students try to role play people that they're not. So, like taking on identities that are not yours, and trying to pretend that they are makes it a very disingenuous interaction. And potentially, what I've seen, at least in our program, when people have done that, it can go sideways really quickly. And so I would caution against that. But also, just diversify your teaching, right? Like sometimes people need to do some stuff on their own. Sometimes people get really nervous in front of other people. So like, scaffold that in the way that your trainees need. But don't move away from some kind of practice because I think we have done a really great job as a field of training people on how to talk really well about therapy. Like, what is it that they actually do? And if it's within these micro skills or if it's through role plays or through just watching their sessions, I do think we need to help provide different forms of feedback to people and engage them in different ways of learning so they don't so they can excel.
Anyone else have a question or comment? Yeah, Juan, did you have something?
Yeah, I do. I have a question. I was just listening to your answer, Jesse, and I was thinking also about what Elise was saying before about uh, how one can receive a microaggression in a third space where there are different power plays at place. No, I'm thinking about how complicated it is to simulate that, whether it's in a role play or deliberate practice, where everything is staged and there are not the same things at play that in a real scenario. So I was before even thinking about even using AI to role play, if that would even help instead of having a student act as someone they're not, or even force them to act as a different culture or different context. But then again, we might be in the very same place because I can probably take a microaggression from an AI, but I might not be able to deal with it in the same way that I would if it's a person on the other side. So I'm just thinking about the complexity of the situation and how to properly train people on humility and cultural responsiveness.
I think that's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind was one of my, it was probably within my fourth year of training. I was seeing this couple and they were just screaming at each other. And in my family, I grew up where my parents, it was a very calm household. They did not argue that way. And so I stopped them right away. I was like, you guys need to stop yelling. They're like, what do you mean? We're just having a conversation. And right, like just kind of that cultural difference between like how certain folks communicate. Like I don't think a role play could got me into the same emotional space of overwhelmness that I experienced in that moment. And so, but what's the proximal things to get you there, right? Like what are the stepping stones so you don't get that shocked when you're in that moment, right? Like nothing's going to replace the lived experience, but like if we can get people exposed to just different cultures that may not be readily available, especially in certain countries or certain areas of countries, how do you get that exposure if you don't get it? And that's the real question. That's where I think this technology can come in handy. I've seen some AI tools that can do some back and forth. Right now, it looks a little choppy in my experience for most of the tools that I've seen, but some of them are getting pretty fancy. I think there's also the drawbacks of, when you're using technology, you're not seeing that reaction in real time. So I think there's, pros and cons of, all these things, right? So kind of like when the computer came out and when the internet came out, it's like, oh yeah, this is good for some things and really bad for other things. And yet we tend to roll with it. And we're all sitting here on Zoom because of it. So.
Yeah. One thing I'll also add to that is I think even a simpler step beyond thinking about like how do we role play this or how do we train our trainees to handle a situation like this is to talk about it, that it's a reality. I think I will say from my training experience, it wasn't until I brought it up into like a supervision that I was microaggressed against and that I was struggling to figure out how to deal with my reactions that it was even brought up that I could be microaggressed against by my client, right? So I think even just sharing that with our trainees that like, yes, this may happen. We don't have the greatest tools right now to prepare you necessarily for like that real moment of when or if it happens, but to go ahead and even just acknowledge that this is a reality that they may have to face and that it's not a bad thing that they have a reaction. Because I think that's another thing. It's like, right, just even acknowledging and just stating it as this is a fact, this can happen. And if you have a reaction, again, don't take it out on the client, of course, but like the fact that you're having a reaction is okay.
Thanks, Jesse and Elise. Those are great points. Any other questions or comments? Joshua, did you have something?
Yeah, listening into the conversation and really seeing the value behind community being reinforced, especially coming up as a therapist and that helping your preparation for being able to um, help clients effectively, it made me wonder about the value behind diversifying that community that you do place around you that could maybe help hold you accountable in the ways that you were mentioning before, but specifically honing in on making sure that you have some representation in that community of people that are either the same or similar identity that could understand your potential clients in the future. It made me, it's a very similar point to what you guys were mentioning before, but I was wondering whether you could expand on it, especially thinking back to our first question, because I think some of her points were around that too.
Josh, I can share a couple thoughts that kind of relate to Joshua's point. One of the early reactions that we got when we started talking about MCO, so I think all of us are trained as counseling psychologists, so there's a strong advocacy focus, a strong social justice focus, and a lot of people are attracted to that when they pick a counseling psychology program. And so one of the first questions we got is, how does this model that focuses on what you're doing in a session, either individual therapy or group therapy, how does that help you think about developing as an advocate and engaging larger systems? And the reason why I bring that up related to your point, Joshua, is I think we're having a lot of conversations about what does MCO have to say about other roles. And so many of us as if you're a psychologist and you're paid for your work, you're in for a long career of middle management is basically what you'll end, so if you get a job, you may be created, you may be put as program coordinator at some point. At some point, someone may ask you to be, chair of your department. If you end up going into a university counseling center, you may get asked to be the training director or the director of the clinic. And so learning to kind of work in systems and possibly either hold institutional authority and work within that system, or potentially sometimes you're putting pressure on a system from the outside. That is part of the training that we have for psychologists. And I do think the ideas around opportunities, comfort, and humility are relevant to that. I think the first distinction I would make, Joshua, is I think that it differs. If you have more privileged identities, I think you might possibly need different kinds of groups, and different kinds of training groups may be more accessible. So one thing that I've noticed is that oftentimes students in our program who are coming from a marginalized identity, they have plenty of exposure to intercultural contact, and that's actually not the gap. Where there might be more of a need is spaces of solidarity where you can be with other people that can talk about a sense of shared values and what it's like to kind of hold certain identities while being in a system that has its own professional subculture. And so these are conversations we're having. We could probably almost do a whole webinar on how to make sure you meet someone's needs for training. But I think the simplest thing I can say is I think people need more than one group to really develop themselves. So I think you need some spaces that are going to challenge you to learn to build trust across cultural groups. And that's one kind of space. And I think you addressed that. I want to just reinforce that it's actually really important to also have spaces where you are able to stay connected to some of the values and identities that are really important to you, and to be able to kind of hold those things, have those things develop together. And I really do think it's a developmental process. I think it happens over the course of, years, maybe 5 to 10 years, not just on the time span of a single semester. So thank you for that question.
Of course, I appreciate it. And like you said, that balance is part of the work.
but we're at time. And so I want to be respectful of everybody's time here. Appreciate you all coming out, and we hope we see you in Japan for SPR and in DC if you're coming to this way for APA.
Thank you. I would just like to say thank you so much to our speakers for introducing your book. This is such an important topic, and the discussion has truly been enlightening. I just want to give a quick reminder that the link to purchase the book is in the chat. Also, thank you all of the attendees for joining us, for your questions, for your very meaningful contributions to the discussion. Just another reminder that the recording will be available on the SPR YouTube channel. The link is also in the chat, and that the early bird registration to the hybrid annual SPR conference in Japan will be open next week. And also please stay up to date with upcoming SPR events. We always have interesting and exciting events planned. You can use the SPR calendar for that. That is also linked in the chat. Thank you all so much for today.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.